Excellent. Thank you. Okay. So from current resume slideshow. Okay. Well, we'll figure it out. So, okay. So we are going to talk about program engagement and pastoral issues related to older adults. And a lot of what I'm going to share with you just comes from experience of working in hospitals with older adults, as well as at CJE, where I've been for 5 years. So these are the kind of the roadmap of what we're going to talk about. I don't know if, can the people on Zoom see this? Because it's not, stop share. Oh, Rabbi Harari says yes.
Not anymore, but yes, a second ago, yes.
Fabulous. Okay, thank you so much, Dan. So we're going to kind of follow this rubric to talk about different issues and learn some. And I always like to start with some information about why we need to pay attention to this. So we're in the middle of what I know people are saying, statisticians, is the silver tsunami. And so we need to be paying attention. And I think that synagogues in particular need to be paying attention because the aging in place is becoming much more substantial. So these are research says that the average age of a nursing home resident at admission remains steady at 83 years. So if you think about, you know, you're already somewhat of an older adult in your 70s, you're going in later. People want to receive home health services longer. And there's a huge number of people who are over 75 living in their own homes, which means that they're in the community and they may be looking to access resources in the community, which includes synagogues. And the pandemic has impacted this. People are less likely to opt for facility-based care for themselves and their families. And people are really, you know, we have stay-at-home orders. People are preferring to stay at home. And I would say that feelings about institutional care before COVID were not seen as unfavorable, but this is part because of the cost of caregiving, shortage of caregivers, and the cost of home modifications. And I think that the Jewish population study, Rudy and I were talking about this, that showed that 50%, or maybe I heard it from Dan, that showed that 50% of Chicago Jewish community was over 55. I think that was from the recent population study. So, I mean, a big population of our population is over 55. So I want to talk about aging brains, because if we have people in our congregations and accessing our educational opportunities or engagement opportunities or ritual, we need to be aware that some of those people are experiencing aging brains. It's just sort of a natural process that happens with people as they age, their organs age, including their brain. So I want to make a distinction. So you probably have people in your community living in your community independently who have something called mild cognitive impairment, which is where a person develops decline in cognition, but it's not severe enough to cause a significant decline in function. And we'll define what function is in a second when we talk about dementia, which is the umbrella term. A lot of times people default and say Alzheimer's, but Alzheimer's is one type of dementia. So this is an umbrella term. So dementia is actually just a decline in cognition significant enough to cause a decline in function and independence. And when we talk about function, we're talking about ability to drive, pay bills, shop, a lot of self-care, daily living activities. And also a decline and at least one of the following: complex attention, executive functioning, learning and memory, language and visual processing. None of these things they could be all of them or they could be one of them. And so it's really important to note that a person does not have to demonstrate memory impairment to receive a diagnosis of dementia. And I share this because a lot of times people assume that dementia means you don't remember things. But it could be that now you no longer can actually handle your bills. That's a executive functioning skill. And so that is, you know, some of these things kind of fall into the realm of, in terms of helping people, like getting to synagogue. A lot of times it falls on like the caring committee, like people need a ride somewhere if they can't drive it anymore. So this is just in visuals. This is from the Alzheimer's Association. Their stats from 2019. I'm sure these numbers have not changed, but you can see the majority of people who fall in is really like 75 to 84. You probably have some pretty active members in your synagogues who are in their 70s. So you could think about that. And the projection is that this number is going to get bigger. The amount of people with these diseases, or Alzheimer's specifically, but other dementias as well, will increase over time because we're an aging population. We're not replacing our population. And so we are an aging population. So you're going to have a lot of people in your communities who are kind of in like the green and orange colors. You know, I mean, I had a conversation yesterday with one of our clients. He's 66 years old, doesn't have Alzheimer's, but utilizing PJE services. He's 66 years old, very young, and utilizing one of our programs. So, and getting support. So, but living in the community still, by the way, living in the community. Oh, okay. So this is where I love to talk about Jewish values. CJE is a values-based organization, but it's also good to think about what are some guiding principles, or what I like to think of as a Jewish theology on aging. Like, what are the guiding principles that prompt us to do the work we do with older adults? So I like to think about honoring and contributing. So this is the famous line from Leviticus, the basis for so much that we do. You shall rise before the ages and show deference for the old. I will say, mipnei seva means gray hair, and we're in the silver tsunami. Like, we're talking about gray-haired people. Even I'm getting gray hair, thanks COVID. So this is where we have it, and this is Psalm 92, the Psalm for Shabbat. That in old age they produce fruit and they are full of sap and freshness. Well, synagogue and community-based agencies can help older adults continue to do that and have them engage in and
can't see what the screen is saying. It's so small.
Rabbi Brief, can you mute?
I'm trying to look. It's so small, that screen.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. So Psalm 92, Rabbi Brief, in old age they still produce fruit, as in Sadiq Katamar. So, there we go.
Yeah, but it's going to cut it off. So
yeah, don't do that. So we want to. You'll get a recording, Rabbi Brief. Okay.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's okay. So
I can't read it. That's all.
We'll send you the slides. So this is from Baba Metzia from the Talmud, that before Jacob, there was no illness leading up to death. Rather, one would die suddenly. But Jacob prayed for mercy and illness was brought to the world. Could you imagine that illness is actually merciful? That is crazy. What are the rabbis thinking? But it's because it gives people the opportunity to prepare for death. This is a drash on the line from Genesis. And one said to Joseph, behold, your father is sick. And the rabbis are like, why are they telling him that his father's sick? Because this is a new idea. And of course, we know from Jacob that he is sort of the iconic figure in Torah of the one who does an ethical will. He sits down with his children and tells them everything before he dies. This is the text to support the idea that we should be supporting people, whether they're in their 50s or they're in their 80s, in advanced care planning. We should be talking and preaching about advanced care planning in terms of people thinking about what they want, who they want to help them with their health care. But this is actually supported in our tradition. And also to see that when people are sick or experiencing just a gradual decline in health, it's an opportunity to think about what to do next, how to care for themselves, but also thinking about imagining what they might want in the future. Okay. So we often, even if you don't have an older adult in your community, you probably have their grown child in your community. And so we think a lot about caregiving, you know, the sandwich generation. And so, but I think there's limitations to caregiving. This is a very famous story also from the Talmud. Rav Asi had an elderly mother and she had all these requests and he took care of those requests. But then she said, I want a husband who is as handsome as you. And at this point, he realized that she was senile and that he would be unable to fulfill all her requests. I read this text as it's okay for families to ask for help in caregiving. A lot of times we feel the pressure. We need to take care of our loved one. It's all on me. It's my responsibility. It is okay to ask for respite help. It is okay in certain circumstances, if you no longer can care for someone, to put them in a higher level of care, in institutional care, if you yourself cannot do it or it crosses uncomfortable boundaries. And that allows actually the family member to maintain their relationship with their loved one. Because here the son is experiencing some pretty uncomfortable boundary crossing and he realizes he can't care for his mother anymore. So really, I think an important text for our time when thinking about the caregivers in our community. Yes. It is true. They don't want others to help, but I think for people who sometimes it's hard to convince people, and sometimes using language from the tradition where they are sitting from. So if they're a Jewish family, using Jewish texts that support that decision or give them the permission to look for help or seek help in the community to support their loved one, that's okay. You know, like I think text is a useful tool in supporting people in these decisions. The other thing I want to bring up is that often there are issues of abuse in caregiving. Either the caregiver is abused or the person being cared for could be abused. And of course, there's adult protective services. CJE has community counseling. There's lots of different resources, but I think it's important to note this text, which I will share with you. Rabbi Tarfon's mother went down to stroll in her courtyard on Shabbat, and Rabbi Tarfon went and laid his two hands under her footsteps so that she walked on them until she reached her bed. What's interesting about this text is that the rabbis praise Rabbi Tarfon. He is the ultimate caregiver to the extreme. They think, wow, he has done such an amazing job caring for his mother. That's great. And if we look at this, we might consider that what's actually happening is that she's literally walking on him. So to me, I can read this the other way, that this is maybe too much, that I wonder how Rabbi Tarfon is experiencing this, that his mother is physically walking on him. So to me, that raises a flag of abuse and something to think about and perhaps address in a pastoral way or to reach out to community partners to help you. Abuse of the caregiver. But it is also true that sometimes the person being cared for can be being abused. So, but there's different ways to think about this. So it's an important thing to think about of how we support our caregivers in the community. Okay. So I spend a lot of time thinking about how to make programming and worship and ritual accessible to older adults. And the laboratory for that is really the CJE buildings, our group home, our adult day programs where people live in the community and come for enrichment, as well as memory care and assisted living, and even independent living now at Tamara's North Shore. So that's sort of my living laboratory for figuring this out. So I want to share with you some insights from that experience. See no service, hear no service. Very basic. These are basic sort of ADA compliance. You want to, our prayer books do not necessarily have large print. So we need to think about having large fonts available. We need to think about hearing assistance. So even when you think that people can't hear, everyone should use a microphone. Okay, so people on the BEMA or in an adult study where there's a lot of people, use a microphone. Don't assume that everyone can hear you.
Don't like using the microphone.
Even if you, that's a great point, Rini, thank you. That even if you don't like to use the microphone, it's really important in terms of inclusivity. I don't know if all of our buildings are ADA compliant or if some of our spaces aren't. I know your building, it's huge and it's beautiful and possibly not. So how do we include people in ritual and in other activities if not all of our spaces are compliant in bringing people of all different physical abilities? I think it's always good as rabbis in ritual, you know, it's like stand, sit, is to think about rise in body or in spirit as you're most comfortable doing that. Can everybody mute?
What you want from me, but what can you say it quickly?
Okay, so just an update from the Medicare. Since you are a privileged customer from the Medicare, you have been qualified to receive some more add-on.
Thank you. We want to be inclusive and not shame people for not standing. You don't want someone standing who's not steady on their feet all the time and then falling in the middle of your Shabbat service, like, or, you know, like that would be horrible. So you don't want that. So not shaming people and being as inclusive as possible. I know that this is a challenge for some synagogues, depending on the orientation of your community. But I do know that some synagogues in our community already do this, is projected liturgy, because Sidurim are heavy. We are not quite there yet at in our communities, but it's something that I'm thinking about down the road as a possible need, depending on how right now people seem to get a lot of benefit from holding a Sidur, and the Sidurim that CJE has are lighter and large print and adapted. But I imagine that if you're in a shul that has a large hardcover prayer book, the idea of projecting liturgy or key liturgy, you know, allows for, I know it's an issue with technology on Shabbat and holidays, but it also makes it potentially more accessible if someone has dexterity issues or vision issues or all those other things. And whenever possible, I know it's really hard with masks, speak face to face. They do make masks that have windows for people who are hard of hearing, and so they could read lips, but it's also really important if someone's in a wheelchair or can't stand up to talk to you, to, if possible, lean down and talk to them face to face. It is a way of preserving their dignity and also allowing you to be more present with them. So those are sort of like basic physical ideas. But I want to talk about including elderly with cognitive impairment, because as I mentioned, you will have people in your community who have mild cognitive impairment, who might have increased visual issues or hearing issues or, you know, processing issues. So we think a lot about like adapting programming for children with different learning abilities. I think we need to think about older adults too, who, because of their changing body and brain, also may need adaptations. And so there's ways to seamlessly, I think, do this without shaming anyone or putting anyone on the spot, and still being able to include them in programming. So I think it is always good to include a sensory component. I have so many stories about this. I once did a 7 species program for where we talked about the 7 species getting close to Shavuot. And I had food for people to taste. And a woman just came out of her shell and shared all these memories from eating a fig. Like, she ate a fig, and all of a sudden she told me the group a whole story about her mother and how she would serve meals and that this would be the dessert. It was an extraordinary moment, but it enriched the group so much. So music is something that is retained for people with cognitive impairment. So incorporating music, particularly familiar melodies, liturgy is amazing for this. People will sing along with you. You'll see people kind of come out of wherever they are if they're not as forthcoming. I like to limit sources shared and sometimes even forget the text study, because some people with cognitive impairment, and definitely people as their vision decreases, lose the ability to read and sometimes write. And they may have challenges expressing themselves, but still want to share. So, like, sometimes just teaching an idea and also doing it through sensory things. So something we did earlier this week, to give you an example that I think works really well, is, and I am very fortunate at CJE to have creative arts therapists at my disposal to collaborate with. So I'm sure you have in your, you may not think about accessing it for adult education, but go to your Hebrew School's art closet and pull stuff out and think broadly outside of Jewish ideas. So this week we did Ma'ariv Aravim, the God who mixes up the evening, like, and unfurls the darkness, sort of as a piggyback onto Hanukkah and light. So we did something to celebrate darkness and sort of the winter solstice. And we talked about that prayer and the image that the Hebrew invokes for people, like the scroll, like the golel, the unrolling. And then I showed them a picture of Van Gogh's Starry Night, which is also a picture of swirls. So if it's a concept that might be hard to conceptualize for some people, draw in things that are familiar to them. They all knew that picture, whether they could name the artist or not. They had seen that picture before. It's so iconic. And it gave them, the mixing of colors and the mixing of night to look at Van Gogh. And then we did an art project. You don't have to do an art project as part of your tech study, but we did art projects that involved swirling colors and things, and it was great. This was in adult day programming and in memory care. But even just to pair familiar things outside of the Jewish canon that are visual or stimulating and match it to enhance an idea outside of reading text, where rabbis and educators were so focused on text, to sort of step outside of that and integrate other things that are familiar to people really enhances the learning and experience. I like to prompt reminiscence and discussion. So I like to incorporate pastoral open-ended questions in study sessions. Yesterday I did a group where we talked about the Parsha this week and, passing on a legacy. So King David teaches Solomon about, how to be a king. Jacob passes on his wisdom to his sons and blesses his grandchildren. What have you passed on to your loved ones? Or what was some wisdom you received from important people in your life? That opens up a whole discussion and engages people. And it can be a very rich discussion, and that could be everyone sharing, not just people with cognitive impairment, but it's an open way for people to access memories and feelings that works really well. Include a simple activity that gets to the core of a teaching holiday or Jewish experience. I like to think, so sometimes it's good to do this. Sometimes if you're a serious tech study group, maybe not. But sometimes having something tactile is great. And with older adults, I like to think of it as like, these are OT skills, like occupational therapy. You want to maintain dexterity, maintain like processing and things like that. So there's nothing wrong with including art in your adult programming. There's nothing wrong with including some kind of physical activity that might, I mean, to a limited degree, but that will help bring it home. I once, for beret sheets, I once gave people clay to hold, to think about the difference between bara and yatsar. So you know, creating out of nothing versus molding something that already exists, like that God does both of these kinds of creation. And what's the difference? Give them a piece of clay and it's sensory, they can squeeze it, but it also kind of magnifies what the difference, why does Torah use these two words? So it's a simple activity, but it's fun and people like it. I do think it's important from a sort of holiday, Shabbat ritual experience, invite participation in ritual and acts that are familiar to preserve a member's dignity. So if someone is struggling physically or cognitively, they probably still know, and they, you know, always did an aliyah, and now you're concerned, well, can they still do an aliyah? I bet you they can. I bet you they still know how to do that. You know, maybe they can't do Hagba, they may be too frail to lift the Torah, but there's probably something ritually that you can include them in that will continue to give them dignity and honor. Yes.
A lot of people a lot of the seniors, including people well into their 90s that I deal with, don't have that kind of time. But when I see sometimes, when I start to talk about reminiscing, prompting reminiscing, when one of these older people starts talking, reminiscing about something happened years ago that might be related even to what we're doing, we begin to see eyes roll. Sometimes these reminiscences go on quite a while.
Well, I think that's the key as an educator, rabbi, facilitator, is to like acknowledge and redirect.
Right.
Like, I think a lot of what I do, and I've talked about this with rabbis in my rabbinic association, and one person said, well, what if you have one person and they like dominate, or they jump in and say something inappropriate, or kind of pull the group somewhere? And I said, you know, sometimes the best thing you can do is pull out your pastoral skills, acknowledge them kindly, and redirect. Like, I think that's sometimes the best way to do it. And I mean, sometimes reminiscence works really well, and sometimes it doesn't. So I think it depends on your goal, but I think the key is to be the one who holds the space and also can direct the space and the group. So that's how I would say that. Yes.
Part of my question for you, I can ask at the end, is if you're in a space like you're in all the time, then kind of people know who's there. If we're in a space in a congregation where there's a real mix of adults with all different kinds of abilities, would you recommend marketing something using language to say this is specifically for older adults with some cognitive impairment in a nicer way than that? That's one question which we could get to. But my response to Ken is sometimes I think the eyes roll when people were coming with the expectation that it was going to be just a tech study, and then they realize that it's going to be. So part of my question is just kind of like, how do we market this so that people come with the patience that they need, or the open-heartedness that they need?
So I think it depends on who's showing up to your programming. So I think that if you have people, so what I'm describing is ways for you to change the culture of your adult study sessions or intergenerational study sessions or whatever you're doing. Because while you have people slowly who maybe are regulars, but they're aging, and then you witness changes, you're like, oh, I don't know what to do. I want them to still come, but I don't know what to do to make them still feel like they're included. Maybe you have one or two people like that, and you're like, oh, I don't know. And now they're not going to come because, you know, and ways to kind of seamlessly just weave in things that might allow them to continue to participate. I do, you know, I don't know. I don't know if you have a mass number of people who are older adults who are starting to show signs of dementia, well, or other issues, maybe you do need to market something or partner with other synagogues or partner with CJE to create more of like, you know, engaging activities or support, you know, caring committees, whatever it is that your community needs. It depends on what the needs are.
All the things you're saying is a way for them to stay doing the things that they love doing.
Correct.
Some extra.
Yes, which doesn't have to necessarily, it could be just culturally seamlessly integrated. Yeah.
Can I just also make a suggestion? When somebody steps in and starts reminiscing, you can say, well, let's bring that to the end.
Yeah, I mean, that's all true. A lot of times they start reminiscing even when you're not asking for reminiscence. And we also have to recognize that in most adult education classes, everybody is a senior.
And
there's almost nobody there under the age of 60, I would say. And
well, then all the more so to all of these things, you know, is what you're offering really meeting or landing for people.
It really is you gotta develop the mastery of facilitation because the reality is most of your congregants with some level of cognitive impairment are going to deny the fact that they have cognitive impairment. So you can market an event towards people with cognitive impairment, they won't come because they don't see themselves.
Right. And also caregivers often are
Right,
also in denial.
So
I think just integrating, that's why I'm advocating for integrating some of these tools, not all of them. I mean, it's based on who shows up to your programming, but if you integrate them, then I bet you know, for the people who you may not realize yet or they don't realize yet are experiencing things, may actually be able to participate more in what you're providing. Some notes on Zoom, because we're in the Zoom world. There's pluses and minuses. So Zoom doesn't always make sense and may be overwhelming to people with cognitive impairment. So I don't know. I know that in this community, some people saw great increases in participation because of Zoom. And other people may not have actually participated. And one of the reasons why might be because of people have older adults. Some of them are very tech savvy. Some of them are not. Low income older adults may not have access to technology. You have lower income people in your community. And also because it just cognitively doesn't make sense that people are on a screen. So just keep that in mind. I think that this is important for front staff, for you, for educators, is you lose the opportunity to assess the whole person. So you lose the sort of flow of who's coming and going in your building, which of course is a problem in the world of COVID, but you also miss seeing things like, how is that person walking? Are they losing weight? You know, like things that would be obvious if you saw someone on a regular basis, and all of a sudden their gait is off, or they're experiencing some weight loss, and you notice it because you are in their lives as their rabbi or their teacher, or if you notice some concerning behaviors or changes, you know, those can be responded to in different ways, you know, in pastoral ways, in, you know, talking with the person, getting to know them. You're not meant to be a doctor, but if you notice changes, because you are community leaders, like if you notice those things, we miss out on that if all we are doing is Zoom. We miss out on seeing the whole person. So, so again, no rhythm to people coming to your room, but on the plus, programs are usually shorter. And that is really good because as we age, we usually have shorter attention spans. So really awesome. Yay, Zoom. Like this is something very positive. And I mentioned the lack of tech savvy. So it's I would say Zoom is a mixed bag for our community and working with older adults. It's a mixed bag. There's definitely pluses and there are also some downsides. Yes, Mark.
Just tried to get into the meeting on in the waiting room. So unless the waiting room is disabled, people are going to be frustrated to get.
Yeah, so there's all different like quirky things for people that'll like barriers, you know. We want to protect our programmings and not have Zoom bombers, but at the same time, it can be very frustrating for people. Like,
Right. But I'm not right now. I'm not.
I understand. But that's
right, we're not monitoring. This is the challenge also of hybrid programming. Like, no, but this is why when giving a presentation and it's hybrid, you always need an extra person to be doing the tech. Like, you can't do both.
Like if you had told us 2 years ago, or like 90-year-olds would be able to Zoom, we would have been like, you're crazy. And the fact that like, I mean, I think like it's amazing that.
And that's wonderful. That's great. I think for some people, they probably, you know, it depends on where you are. Like some people are very savvy.
You know, like we always had to make sure you can't just provide the Zoom link, you have to provide that
Phone number, the phone number.
And I don't have anybody. All of those in the pandemic, like they've all got their iPad, you know. Now, granted, there's not an economic, you know, we don't have necessarily the economic barriers.
Right. I also said like culturally too, like I know at CJE for some of our community programs and support groups, particularly in the Russian community, a lot of them are calling in. I mean, I don't know if they're still are calling in, but I know that at a certain point of the pandemic, for a very long period of time, people were calling into groups. And so people couldn't see each other's faces. So that was a downside for the facilitator, but it was partly because of
Them, they can't unmute themselves.
right. It's a lot of issues. Okay. So pluses and minuses, you know, really pluses and minuses, but we want to acknowledge them. I know not all of us are rabbis, but these are things to just think about that our people are experiencing. And for rabbis, I think as pastoral care providers, really important. So loss is kind of like a huge part of what we deal with, grief, but grief for all different things, independence, health, cognition and memory, peers and family dying, the worst. And I have to say, if you live long enough, you often outlive your children. That's like a reality. If you're 100, maybe you had children starting at 20, so your child is 80, you know, that's a full life. 80 is a full life and you might outlive them. I mean, it's a very hard thing, but also peers, you know, if you lose all your friends, it's hard to make friends. It's hard to make friends, someone who's middle-aged, let alone like someone who's older, you know, you can't do it. It's very hard. And we're a very mobile society. Even during COVID, people moved. So like we're a mobile society. So it used to be communities would stay and live their whole lives in a community and children would stay close. And for some of my clients, that is still true, but I don't live near my family. And lots of other people don't live near their family. You move where a job is or where an opportunity is. And so people lose their support system and people feel isolated and lonely, and also a sense of feeling invisible. You know, I mean, I've worked in congregations, but I've never been like a pulpit rabbi. So this is a somewhat of a skewed view, but I do know that being in, and also just being a member of being in community, that a lot of times we put a lot of focus on the next generation, Lador Vador, and thinking about children and families of a certain age, like raising children of a certain age or teenagers or going to college. And, you know, yes, you have the people who are 60 and older showing up to Torah study, but that's not everybody who's over 60. And like, what is being provided for them? And especially as it becomes maybe harder to come to synagogue, if you don't drive at night, you always came to Friday night services, but now you don't drive at night, they disappear and they're isolated and lonely. Now, again, in a Zoom world, maybe it's not as much of an issue, but those people then lose out on the community piece and the social piece, which are also really crucial. And the other piece about invisibility is that there's really no formal life cycle events for people between like marriage and death. I hate to say it, but it's true. I know Ritual Well is really good at finding, and it's sort of like a ritual hub of creating new rituals using Jewish tradition to explore different moments as people age. And that's a great resource. But formally in Jewish tradition, there's not much. Recognizing special birthdays. Yeah, I mean, things in their family life, yes, but for them personally, there's, you know, besides birthdays, there may not be as much formal ritual. And so it creates a sort of sense of invisibility, I think, for some people. Feelings of grief, shame, and stress. We've talked about this. Never put me in a nursing home. The issues of sandwich generation and caregiver burnout. There's a lot of gender inequity in aging and caregiving. It often lands on women who are also maybe raising children, who also might have a job. There is an enormous cost of aging and care and financial burdens. It's unbelievable. Just the cost. There's a lot of costs associated with if you can age. Even if you have health insurance, you may need home health. You may need a caregiver round the clock. You might need to go to assisted living, which assisted living is a wonderful thing, but they don't take Medicaid. And that's just the reality of the structure. So there's lots of different interesting pieces about this. And long-term care insurance is very expensive. Thank you, Ken. So all of these components, you know, it's like people save for retirement. I wonder if we also need to be talking about people preparing for all of these things early on. Okay, so just, there's a lot of ambiguous loss because everyone's losing along the way and there's no ritual markers for these. Something that I experience a lot as the chaplain working in assisted living is that when people realize they need extra help and maybe assisted living is the best choice for them, which is a wonderful thing to get that extra help and move into a community that's supportive, they are also leaving their home. Maybe they lived in their home for 50 years. And that is an enormous point of grief, you know, like, so that piece, like the giving up of what you thought your life was, is very, there's no real marker for that. And some people feel grief or shame about, we talked about this before with the text about Rav Asi, is like, there might be mixed feelings about handing over the caregiving to somebody else. Closure is a wonderful topic that is very important to people. It may raise things in ourselves as rabbis and caregivers and teachers, but they're important topics to cover. Life review, unfinished business, regrets, reconciliation, forgiveness. These are things that rabbis can talk about from the Bima, themes. You could do it in your pastoral work. You can highlight when these things happen in Torah if you're an educator, of people modeling reconciliation, No, we just finished Genesis. There's lots of reconciliation that happens in the book of Genesis. Like you can highlight these and name it as, look, there's reconciliation. We learn from this. You know, we learn how to do this in our own lives by either seeing the pitfalls of this wasn't such a good reconciliation, or this was a really powerful reconciliation, and we can learn from it. So people want to sort out their unfinished business at the end of their life, and they want to talk about it. So sometimes these things can be really integrated already into, like, if you're doing a Parshat HaShavua, you know, Joseph and his brothers, we just read it, you know, like there's a lot that can be done on themes, on pastoral themes that could really help people think through their own stuff, you know, maybe not in the class, but, you know, it's learning that'll land a certain way for people. Okay, so I just, yes.
Presentation. I'm just thinking about loneliness and isolation and stuff like that. I've heard from a number of, and I wasn't very good at this myself when I was in the congregation. So that's you. People tell me they haven't been to shul since COVID started, and there was a committee in the shul that was calling people in the beginning periodically, especially older people, to check in on them. I don't know. I don't think they're still doing that anymore. The people especially have complained about they haven't heard from the rabbi. You know, I used to come every week and he never called. And I think it's really important, even though it's difficult, we have lots of constraints on our time, to make an effort periodically to reach out to people who may be isolated.
Yeah, like to designate and block time on your schedule to call people you know are shut in each week to check on them. Like that's a very powerful thing, and it communicates.
They have all sorts of other, they
Right.
have children around. They may be going whatever they're doing, but their connection with the synagogue has been lost.
Right. So I think that,
that,
you know, whether it's caring communities, or rabbis or cantors or educators, or like, there's always going to be people in your community who are isolated and don't feel like they have a connection, or they've lost a connection because maybe they're immunocompromised and they're never going to come. And, you know, it's a very powerful thing to get a call from your rabbi, like, or from someone who, like, if they always came to your Torah study and you're the educator and you don't see them anymore, you've resumed in person, but they're not coming, to get a call from you to say, I care about you. Like, how amazing is that? Like, even just a brief conversation can be extremely important. Okay, I just want to raise a few case studies. We don't have to like dish it out. Two of them are actual cases that I've experienced in the last 5 years, and one of them is sort of made up, but is meant to sort of bring home a point. So this is related to the cost of aging. I actually just did this woman's funeral, like breaks my heart. 3 children who have a 95-year-old mother are nervous to tell her she has outlived her money. She currently lives in assisted living and has a 24-hour caregiver who helps her. They plan to move her to a nursing home where her stay and care will be covered by Medicaid. So this is that financial issue, the shift. The family chooses to bring you, the rabbi, for pastoral support. When the family tells her, she bursts into tears and grabs your hand, stating, "But I thought I would die here." So transitions are extraordinarily powerful and hard. I would encourage you to make yourself available to support grown children as they manage these issues with their loved ones. Like, you have an older adult in assisted living, they're probably not coming to your synagogue, but their adult children probably are. And to make yourself available to support them in these moments is unbelievably important. This raises so many different issues, emotional issues, financial issues, transitions, end of life. There's so many things that a rabbi or a cantor, someone with pastoral skills, can really help with this transition. Well, I had a relationship with this person, and I had okay. So this was someone who lived in assisted living. So I had a relationship with the 95-year-old, and also by extension, had encounters with the grown children before. I listened, we talked, we grieved together. I think, the first initial response by her was enormous amount of grief because the assisted living building had become her home. So it's like you live in a home in the community and you have to move. That's a transition, that's a loss, but also changing care, like where you live, changing building, like that's a loss. So the first thing we did together was grieve and acknowledge how sad it would be, and also talk about what would be maybe the same that she'd still be able to do. She'd still be able to observe Shabbat. She'd still be able to do different, like, that a lot of her pictures of her family and all these things that surrounded her that made her comfortable would go with her, so there was just a lot of grieving, but also helping kind of walk through transition. Like I didn't deal with any of the behind the scenes paperwork. I just pastoral. The family needed support. They were afraid to tell her. The grown children were afraid to share this information. So I was there not just for her and her response, but also the grown children who really were nervous.
This scenario will play itself out today. It's happened every day. I think what Rabbi said, letting them grieve. One of the other things that I found that also works is for the older adult is tell them what a relief it will be to their children and how concerned their children are about them and that they receive best care.
All of that, like reassurances.
They want to know that they're creating a burden for their kids. So if you can, everything she said, plus this is going to allow your children to sleep easier at night.
Knowing you're still cared for.
Right.
No, I had like a congregation. So I, in many ways, function like a congregational rabbi, but for our buildings. So that's the only parallel I could say. So I had a multi-year relationship with this woman before her and her family, before her children called me and said, oh my God, we have to tell her this. And we're so scared, which could be the same scenario, but you're supporting a caregiver, a grown child in their 50s or 60s who has an aging parent. And then they call you and say, oh my God, I have to tell them something and they're not going to like it. And I want to continue to respect my mom, my dad. How do I do this? So this is, like Dan said, this is going to keep happening, these transitions. And so we can be key people to support people through these changes. It is very, very common. We're talking about people who are like grown adults who are taking care of older adults, but it's even more common for the elderly to be caring for the elderly, for spouses or partners to be caring for each other, or siblings caring for each other, peers, age peers. So this also happened. The adult daughter whose parents are in their 70s, which some people think is not so old, but it is often when physical ailments really start to express themselves, expresses overwhelm and nervousness about placing her mother in memory care. Again, a transition of space. Her father was the primary
Why was I muted? Okay. All right, we'll figure that out. I hope it's on the recording. Thank you for being here today, everybody. Please reach out to me if you want to be in touch with Michelle Stern or Dan Fagan. And thank you for being here. Thank you, everybody. I don't know. Carmit said that, okay. We lost sound on Zoom. Do you really want to know?
No.
Why did we become muted?
A recording won't have Wi-Fi.
Come back. I always do. I can come back. I learned stuff. So
Well, I'm going to send everyone your slides.
I think that's